It's an honor to welcome you to the second lecture of the Griliches Lectures of this year. Just to remind everybody, the lecture series is in honor of one of our most important founding leaders of NES. Zvi was one of the pivotal members of the International Advisory Board from the very beginning, and whatever quality standards the school has is because Zvi insisted that we have them, and the sort of rigor he not only did in his own research, but insisted that NES follow is a great example for us, and he was a wonderful leader. And it's an important thing every year that when we have this lecture series in his honor. And we're very fortunate this year, as Sergey mentioned yesterday, so I'm not going to repeat, but Professor Elhanan Helpman from Harvard University was one of the original members of the International Advisory Board of New Economic School. And of course, it's wonderful to have him back just for that reason alone. But also because of the enormous contributions in so many different fields. And today, I guess we get the empirical part of firm heterogeneity. And let me stop there because everyone came to listen to Elhanan. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me remind you that yesterday I provided the motivation for the approach to international trade that emphasizes within sectoral heterogeneity. And I mentioned yesterday that over the years, the study of international trade has shifted from intersectoral trade flows to within sectoral trade flows. And most recently, to the participation of firms in international trade and how it impacts trade. Now this last emphasis has very important implications for a variety of areas in international trade. And one of them is foreign direct investment. As far as foreign direct investment is concerned, the literature has evolved in two different directions. One has to do with what originally was termed horizontal FDI, which is a way in which firms serve foreign markets. Namely, a firm invests in a foreign market, it builds a production facility or it acquires a production facility there, and then it manufactures there for the local market. This is what we call horizontal FDI. There is another form of FDI which traditionally has been studied, and this is vertical FDI. And this is where a firm goes to a foreign country, it acquires a subsidiary, and then this subsidiary may do one of two things. It may manufacture intermediate inputs, which are then shipped back to the parent firm, and the parent firm uses the intermediate inputs in order to produce a final product. Alternatively, the parent firm may shift intermediate inputs to the subsidiary will assemble them and sell them all over the place. So these are the two traditional forms of FDI. It so happened that in the last 20 years, the forms of FDI have become much more complex. So many companies build production platforms in the country, not only in order to serve the local market, but to export from there to third markets. And this generates interesting linkages in terms of the supply of intermediate inputs, which are much richer than the vertical structure. So, given the new emphasis on the participation of firms in foreign trade, there is a new emphasis also on trying to understand how firms organize their production networks in a global economy of this type. What I will do today, because this literature is large and takes a long time to review, is I will discuss first the empirical implementation of the firm heterogeneity idea to estimates which try to distinguish, to actually traditional estimates of what's known as gravity equations, but trying to distinguish between intensive and extensive margins, and I'll explain later why this is of interest. And the second part of my talk, I will discuss FDI, but I will focus only on the horizontal form of FDI. The reason is that to discuss vertical FDI, at least the modern literature, requires a lot of time because it relies heavily on contract theory. I know that all of you have studied contract theory. You are very lucky to have courses in contract theory because very few places offer them. And this is sort of fundamental to this emerging literature on FDI. So in any case, I'm not going to talk about this part, but you'll get some sense of how FDI might work in the horizontal dimension. So let me move on to the empirical implementation of the ideas that I discussed yesterday and how things can be estimated. So let me start. What is this? So let me start with the following observation that actually proves to be very useful for this sort of estimation, but which was considered to be a hindrance in the older empirical literature. And this is that if you look at data, then if you look, for example, at sectoral level data, trade flows, what you find is this unbelievable number of zero observations, basically no trade flows. But the more surprising thing is that if you look at country level data, and you look at bilateral trade flows. So think about an observation as exports from one country to some other country. Say exports from Russia to Germany will be one observation. Then exports of Germany to Russia, if they exist, are a second observation. And so on. All bilateral trade flows. Then at the country level bilateral trade flows, there are also many zeros. So here is a sort of figure of how these different forms of trade evolve over time. So at the bottom is the fraction of observations. These light purple bars give you the fraction of observations in which there are positive trade flows in both directions. Okay? The yellow ones above represents the fraction of observations in which there are zeros in both directions. And in the middle, there are the observations, the fraction of observations where there's a positive in one direction and a zero in the other direction. Okay. So the main point to observe is that large fractions are zeros, basically, even at the country level data. Now there is some debate as to whether a zero is a zero. It's not so simple, because the way the data are collected is essentially by reporting. So the most comprehensive data is collected by the UN, and countries essentially report to the UN. And people who build these data sets, they try to check these reports. So for example, if one country reports that it exports to some other country $100 million, but the other country does not report that it has imported $100 million, which happens, then they code it as if there are $100 million of exports. So in these cases, but if basically there are, the two sides report that there are no imports and no import, not export and no import, then they code it to them. Now it turns out that some of these zeros are not exactly zeros either. And there is some debate about these observations, and this contaminates the data, it contaminates the estimates, and there's an issue of how to deal with it. I'm not going to deal with these issues now. So let's assume that a zero is a zero, basically, in this data. Now, this depends also on the samples that you are going to use. If you use data on richer countries, then the zeros are real zeros. But if you expand the sample to include many very small countries, this is where some doubts arise. Okay. So typically when people estimated trade flows, what they did was they maintained the positive observations. And they tried to explain the trade flows, bilateral or otherwise, as functions of observable characteristics of countries. Okay. Now this obviously raises the following issue. If there are zero trade flows, and you just don't account for them, you obviously throw out some information, but this typically might bias your estimates as well. So these are sort of standard selection bias problems with which we are familiar. But if you think about the intensive and extensive margin, then there are actually further problems. And this is, if you run regressions of the usual type, you basically can expect an omitted variable bias because you don't control for the extensive margin. On the other hand, the zeros tell you a lot, or can, in principle, tell you a lot about the extensive margin. So the question is, instead of treating the zeros as a problem, can you take advantage of these zeros in order to obtain better estimates, including this separation? Okay, so this is the idea behind this paper that Melitz, Rubinstein, and I wrote, which tried to develop a methodology for using the zeros and providing better estimates overall, in particular separating the intensive from the extensive margin. But in order to do this, I need to expand a little bit the theory. I used very simple model yesterday, so I go quickly over a little bit more elaborate structures that are more amenable to estimation. Okay, so let's go back to the sort of basic model that we had yesterday. So think about this phi is the productivity of a firm, and think about its inverse. And now, because we are going to go to data, we don't want to talk about labor only, so think about this as a bundle of inputs. So A represents a bundle of inputs that are being used to produce 1 unit of output. And this, for this study, we don't disaggregate this bundle, but think about it as a bundle. So then you can write the profits of country J exporting to country I by a firm with this requirement per unit output A, the inverse of the productivity of the firm. Using essentially the model from yesterday, you can derive this equation. I'm sorry, there's a switch in notation here. I don't know if you remember yesterday's notation, but if you do, the notation here is a little bit different. So what was rho yesterday is alpha today. What was sigma yesterday is epsilon today. But if you don't remember, that's fine too. The key is that epsilon is the elasticity of substitution, and epsilon is just equal 1 over 1 minus alpha. And it sort of happens in these monopolistic competition models that the operating profits are a fraction 1 minus alpha of revenue. And this is what we have here. Okay, so how the key, so the parameters are less important except that epsilon is bigger than 1. But the key variables here are the following. So we think about Cj as the effective cost of the bundle of inputs. Okay? Now we allow this cost to vary across countries. Why do we allow this cost to vary across countries? Because if you look at data, then they basically vary. In particularly, there are differences, significant differences across countries in total factor productivity. So if you try to estimate Higgs neutral shifters, these Higgs neutral shifters vary substantially across countries. So if there are such differences, they will be absorbed in the estimation by this measure. Even if factor prices are the same for physical units, they will not be the same for effective units. Okay? So this is this cost. Then tau ij is simply, as yesterday, the melting iceberg cost parameter, except that now it's written in a form that this is for shipments from country J to country I. And generally speaking, they will be, you can assume if you want that they are symmetric, but sometimes they will not be symmetric, so there's no necessity to assume it ahead of time. Then PI is the price index of consumption or of absorption in the destination country, namely the importer country. So it has an index I. And YI is the demand level, which usually we proxy by GDP in the destination country, the importing country. And Fij is the fixed cost of exporting from country J to country I, and this is common to all firms, so it doesn't depend on the productivity of the firm. So it doesn't depend therefore also on the inverse of the productivity, namely this measure of A, of how many units of inputs you need per unit out. Okay, so this is the basic equation that we take from yesterday. Well, then using the logic from yesterday, we can identify a cutoff Aij, which is simply the input requirement at which a firm breaks even if it exports to country J. To country I. A firm from J exporting to I. By the way, this equation applies also to domestic sales, so you can have JJ. Okay? With this, so we can identify these cutoffs in principle. So now the point is the following: that only firms with productivity which is higher than this marginal firm will export, which means only firms with input requirement below this cutoff will find it profitable to export. All other firms which have higher input requirements, which means they have lower productivity, they will essentially not be able profitably to export. Okay, so if you want to have zeros, if you want to explain zeros in the data, it means that you need to use a distribution which generates situation under which there will be, it's possible for all firms to have a requirement A which is actually above this cutoff. Then no firm will be able to satisfy this inequality. If this is the case, then you will not observe exports from country J to country I. Now obviously if you use a distribution which is with an unbounded support, then this will never happen. There always will be some exports. So you need to use some distribution with a bounded support. So an example of such a distribution is to choose some of the bounds like this, to choose a distribution G which has these bounds. And one possibility that I would describe is to use a truncated Pareto. Okay? But you might use some other things as well. In the estimation, I'll argue that you can estimate it under the truncated Pareto assumption, but if you don't want to commit to a functional form, then you can use semi-parametric or non-parametric methods, and they basically yield very similar results. Okay, so once you do this, then you can see that if Aij is just above this lower bound AL of this distribution, then some firms export. But if the Aij happens to be below, then obviously there's no exporting firm, and then you should observe a zero. So this is the sort of modification of the theoretical structure. Okay, so now let's look. Suppose you think about countries which trade with each other. Then in every country there's some number of firms, NJ, which exist, and each one of them has to decide whether they want to export to one country, two countries, three countries. By the way, in the data, what you also see is that there's variation as to how many countries are served by particular firms. And this variation is important, although we are not going to exploit it here. So with these n firms, you look at every firm according to its productivity, whether it finds it profitable to export from J to I or not. You integrate over all these firms using the distribution that you have chosen. And this gives you this simple equation of trade. And this is the equation that we will estimate. So it's sort of important to understand what it consists of. So these are aggregate exports from country J to country I. They depend on the trade costs. They depend on the effective cost of inputs in the exporting country. They depend on the price level in the importing country, on income in the importing country, the number of firms in the exporting country, and on this coefficient Vij, which comes from the integration. And this depends on the distribution. So this can be 0 if no firm passes the test of profitability, essentially. Okay? So this is the equation we are going to estimate. Now, what happens is, just as a short digression, you can go from here directly to what's known as a gravity equation in the classical form. And how do you do it? You just, again, you use the budget constraint so that income is generated by sales from all sorts of sources. And once you do it, you get this equation, which is exactly a gravity equation. Why is it a gravity equation? It tells you that exports from J to I depend on the product of the two countries' GDP levels. It also depends on the sum here, but this is constant across the two countries. And on this coefficient. So just a historical remark. The original gravity equation was proposed by Jan Tinbergen in a famous study in 1962. It's a little book that he wrote in 1962. And he basically had the following intuition. He said, you know, when two countries exist, the attraction of trade across them is proportional to the product of their income levels. This is the gravity component. But he said there are all sorts of impediments to trade. Because there are impediments to trade, these impediments, they reduce this fraction if they are high, and they increase it if they are low. So the variation across pairs of country will not be an exact gravity, but a corrected gravity for these impediments. Okay? And he called this coefficient a trade resistance measure. This is what he called it. So in using Tinbergen's language, this term here is a trade resistance measure. You see it depends on all these trade costs that are built into here. And they also depend on these Vij's, which also actually depend on trade costs, because these cutoffs, Aij, also depend on trade costs. So this is a very complicated function of trade costs. An important observation here is the following, that while these coefficients here are variable trade costs, the cutoffs depend both on variable trade costs and on fixed trade costs. And this is something that can be used for identification. Okay. So this is an elaborate Tinbergen type gravity equation. It has some undesirable properties as it stands, because we have imposed this requirement, which essentially means also that trade is balanced. And it generates estimates, if you enforce it, which are not consistent with the data. Okay? So we will not use this. But what it does point out is an important point that was made. I don't know, maybe you don't want to know so much about international trade, but you are now a captive audience, I'm going to tell you anyway, right? So it sort of points out something that originally was pointed out in a 2003 paper by Anderson and Van Winkel, and in which they argue the following: if you estimate the gravity equation, you need to take into account what they call third country effects. So you cannot use just data of the pair of countries which trade with each other. How they are related to other trading partners is actually important, because it will influence these estimates. And as you can see here in the denominator, all the trade costs with the other countries interact, including the price levels. So this is another way to see this point that was made. Okay, why?
Is that the sum over all other countries?
Yes.
Or neighbors? Or
All the countries that you trade with.
Oh.
All the countries that you trade with. So if you trade with 100 countries, all of them should be in this summation. Okay, so why do I dwell on the gravity equation? The reason is simple. Since 1962, when Tinbergen proposed it, it has been estimated infinitely many times on infinitely many data sets. And it always works. Okay? So there's something very attractive about it. It took, however, many years to produce a theory that will generate the gravity equation. And this is just an elaborate variant of simpler theories that will generate gravity equations. So you don't need this elaborate theory just to generate the gravity equation. This is a rich theory which you can use for other purposes as well. But the point is that it's so central to international trade that we are always eager to understand exactly how the trade frictions impact trade. And this is the way to estimate. And in fact, it's also used in other contexts, like in political economy, when people need some instrument, sometimes they use the gravity equation, and they use the exogenous variation from it to instrument whatever they need to instrument. Okay, but this is a side issue.
Next question. When you say it works, what do you mean? Then the coefficients at log y, I, and y will be significant? Or?
Yes. No, there will be close to 1 actually.
Okay. Close to.
Yeah. It will be very close to 1. It sort of varies with data sets, but the more important thing is, again, I want to go back to I want to emphasize this equation, which obviously is consistent with gravity, yes? But the point is that once you use this equation, you can estimate the impact of different trade frictions. So the way it's written now, the trade friction that is built in here is, if you want, these melting iceberg frictions. But you can substitute it for any other frictions, like common language, common religion, common legal system, whatever you think might affect how much countries trade with each other. These sort of frictions can be built into it. And they are actually. Well, you see when we do the estimates. Okay. So now, if we assume that productivity is distributed Pareto, but a truncated Pareto, in order not to have infinitely productive firms, then basically we can use this distribution function for G. So K is an important parameter in this distribution function. It's called the shape parameter of the distribution, and it controls the degree of dispersion. So this I would like you to remember, that K controls the degree of dispersion. Okay, well, we'll need it eventually. So it's a simpler parameterization. If you want to go along with it, then you can actually get an equation which you can estimate precisely. But as I said, if you don't want to commit to Pareto, then there are other methods for estimation. But with Pareto, one sort of nice thing is that you can show that this coefficient Vij, which integrated over the exporting firms, is proportional to something very simple, which is here. It's just, you look at the ratio of this cutoff at which it's profitable to export and the minimum labor requirement per unit output. And of course, this depends on the elasticity of substitution and the degree of dispersion. But the point is that once you commit to Pareto, you get a very simple functional form for explaining this Vij. Of course, you still have to explain Aij, but once you have Aij, you can explain Vij. Okay, so the next thing is, for every type of trade friction, you need to assume something about its behavior. So let's take this one. So think about if this is, say, freight, then think about dij as the distance between the two countries to the power of gamma. Then we'll be interested in this coefficient gamma. How sensitive trade costs are to distance. And for every trade friction, you can formulate something similar and formulate a coefficient which tells you how sensitive trade flows are to this particular friction. And then there's some normally distributed disturbance UIJ. Okay? So this will be a typical formulation, and we will be interested in this coefficient. Once we have formulated this, then the basic trade flow equation that I showed you before can be expressed in this form, where lowercase letters are the uppercase letter variables written in logarithmic form. It's the log of the uppercase variables. You are familiar with this notation. So lowercase mij is the natural logarithm of the volume of exports from country J to country I. Okay? And then lowercase dij is the natural logarithm of the distance between the two countries. And in this form, this coefficient gamma appears linearly in the equation. Then another variable that we have here is wij, which comes from here. And this is essentially the proxy to the extensive margin, because you can show that this is monotonically related to the fraction of firms that choose to export. We know that this is related to Aij, and given the distribution, and therefore it's also monotonically related to Wij. So we think about this as controlling for the fraction of exporting firms. So if you take now the theory seriously, then it gives you guidance for estimation in a number of ways. One important thing is that it tells you that you need exporter and importer fixed effects. And if you disregard it, you are in trouble. So what are these, say, the exporter's fixed effects? They absorb the variables which are specific to the exporting country only. Which are they? Like the total number of firms that exist in the country, or the cost of a bundle of these inputs. Okay? So this is now absorbed in these fixed effects. But you also need fixed effects of the importer. Why? Because remember that the exports from J to I depend on the demand level in I, so it depends on the GDP of the country, and depends importantly on the price level. Well, basically, we don't have data for large samples of countries on this. But as long as they are absorbed in fixed effects, we are okay. Or so we hope. Okay, so this is the basic equation that we are going to estimate. Now the problem, of course, here is that this equation applies to only positive trade flows. So generally speaking, Uij is this normally distributed with mean 0. However, when you estimate this equation, you have a conditional distribution, which is conditioned on Mij being positive, and the mean of this conditional distribution is obviously not 0. So this is the usual selection bias. So if you were to estimate this equation as people usually do, just regressing the log of trade on distance, say, then you'll introduce two biases. One is the selection bias, and the other is an omitted variable bias, this Wij, which controls for the fraction of exporting firms. Okay, so these are the sort of two issues. So how do we overcome these issues? Well, to overcome these issues, one procedure that can be used is the following. Take now the data which includes the zero trade flow. Then you can estimate a selection equation, essentially. A first stage equation which tells you which country exports to which. Make it a function of all the variables which the theory suggested you need, like variable trade cost, fixed trade cost, and the like. And then make the correction for selection. But what you can then do is the following. Even so, you don't have direct observations on what fraction of firm from J exports to I. You can use the first stage equation to project the fraction of exporters. Because from those estimates, you can get an estimate of Wij. So, by estimating a first stage selection equation, you can correct for both types of biases simultaneously. Of course, you'll get bigger standard errors on the estimate here, but in principle, you can do it. Okay, so this is essentially the methodology that we are going to apply. So what are the main results from this estimation? So let me just go back. So if you have these estimates, you can now also separate the intensive margin from the extensive. How? We'll find out how distance, say, affects the trade volume through this gamma, but also how distance affects trade volumes through the Wij. And this will provide the separation between the two. Okay, so what are the main? So the main results are the following: that generally speaking, if you don't make the two corrections, you sort of overestimate the sensitivity of trade flows to trade frictions by about 1/3, roughly speaking. It varies across the trade friction variables. And this is essentially what the extensive margin picks up. The other thing that you find is,
Could you write down the first stage equation? What are the exclusion restrictions?
yeah, so the exclusion restriction, it's straight from the, I didn't prepare a slide for it. The exclusion restriction in the first stage equation is a variable which affects fixed cost, but not variable cost. And in the empirical analysis, it's a combination of the cost of establishing business in the different countries. Okay. Now you can introduce a second exclusion restriction using a Sargan test to show that it satisfies the conditions, which is a variable which we call common religion. But you don't need it if you use smaller data sets, like up to 19 countries for which there is data on the cost of forming businesses. But if you want to go to larger samples, you don't have this sort of data, then you can use the other variable, which passes the Sargan test if you believe in the test. If not, stick to smaller samples. Or find another exclusion restriction. But every exclusion restriction has to have this property. It's something that affects the fixed cost, but not the variable cost. And then it satisfies the exclusion restriction. Okay? So the second thing is that if you look at the results, then what happens is that most of the bias comes from the omitted variable and not from the selection bias. And finally, because of these variations, there's really no symmetry. Wij is not the same as Wji, so you might be interested in sometimes, if you want to know how the extensive margin works, typically the extensive margin from J to I is different from I to J, and the variation in this is very large. It's a factor of about 3. At least for this data set. Okay? Okay, now, so this is in terms of estimation. I'll show you some of the results. But I want to make another remark. So there's some new work which tries to decompose for data sets which include firm level data, the fraction of the variation that's explained by the extensive margin versus the intensive margin. So if you have firm level data, you can do a decomposition. It's like a variance decomposition. So for the US, there's a recent study by Bernard Redding and Schott, and they decompose it into three parts. So they decompose it into intensive versus extensive, and the extensive they decompose into the number of firms and the number of products per firm. Because as I mentioned yesterday, most firms, especially the big exporters, they produce a range of products. Okay. And according to their estimates, in the US data, about 80% of the adjustment to shocks comes from the extensive margin. So this is big in terms of how it influences the economy, be it as a result of trade reform or some other external shock. And for this reason, we obviously should be interested in it. So how do these estimates look like? Can you see anything of here? Huh?
Control plus.
Yeah. We need to increase it, okay. Is it better? Okay, so these estimates are for the sample of countries for which there is data on the cost of forming business. So this is the first stage probit. This is the benchmark which you estimate without any of the corrections. And so these estimates, let's focus on distance because this is a pretty standard variable. But you have here the whole list of variables that people usually use in gravity equations. If you have a common currency, if you belong to the same free trade area, and all things of this sort. The point is, so this is a pretty typical estimate for distance. So this is the alternative estimate using the two controls, both for selection and the omitted variable. It's estimated with nonlinear least squares. This is the parameter delta, which comes from the nonlinear equation if you assume a truncated Pareto distribution. So these estimates read numbers out of the functional form to some degree. So they are functional form dependent. And then we have the selection correction here, this one. This is the standard coefficient on the inverted Mills ratio. So the point to note is that this coefficient is significantly lower than this one, okay, in absolute value. So the next column gives you the same set of estimates using a semi-parametric method. So now you move away from the assumption that you have a truncated Pareto distribution, and you just approximate the distribution with a polynomial. And as you can see, the estimates are pretty close. Okay. And the last two are estimates using non-parametric methods. So basically, you split the sample into bins, and you have a coefficient every bin, so you approximate an arbitrary functional form. And here it depends on how many bins you construct, and it's a little bit different, but it's again much lower than what we have in the benchmark. So the point is, this sort of shows you that there is a significant bite to the extensive margin, and if you don't control for it, then you attribute to, for example, the expansion in sales per firm, what should be an expansion in the volume of trade by firms, plus entry perhaps of new firms, or an expansion, okay? In the terms that we discussed last time. to go up. It's not good. Huh? Yeah, no, but but now you won't see anything, right?
Concentrate.
No, but this is.
Next slide.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now the issue of whether it's heterogeneity or a selection bias. So to make this comparison, basically the first two columns are the same as they were before, and here in this column we do a correction for heterogeneity, but no correction for selection bias. And in the last column, there's a correction to selection bias, but no correction for heterogeneity. And the point here is that if you do just selection bias, you are pretty close to the original estimates. But if you do a correction to the benchmark, I mean, if you do a correction for heterogeneity and no selection bias, you are closer to the corrected estimates, where you do both. So that's all it's saying is, now the selection bias is significant. In terms of statistical significance, you need to do it. But in terms of by how much it moves the estimated coefficient, it doesn't move them by an awful lot. Most of the movement comes from the heterogeneity. Okay, so this is a sort of illustration of how this type of theory can be used for estimation and to obtain more reliable estimates, hopefully, and also to get this separation between the intensive and extensive marketing, particularly since the adjustment in the extensive marketing is very important in the data.
Can you explain the logic why common religion affects on fixed costs, but
No.
not the variable costs?
No, I cannot, but this is why I said that the way it was done is, this is done on the larger sample. Huh?
And with regulation?
Yeah, so the idea of the cost of forming a business typically should affect only fixed costs.
No, it commonly correlates very much with the costs of actually doing business rather than not doing business, but yeah, no, I understand what
And the way it's done here is you use them in both countries. And they have to be above a threshold in both of them. So it's not a one country variable. You actually can't use a one country variable because you have the country fixed effect. So there has to come from both. If you don't, if you are not convinced, then you will not be convinced with the estimates. But the interesting thing is that if you replace this with the religion variable, which just statistically seems to satisfy the restrictions, you get about the same estimate. Now this doesn't give you a lot of confidence, yes, but yes, you have to be convinced that the cost of forming business is a suitable variable that satisfies the exclusion restriction. Okay, so let me move on to the, oh, I have to go down there. Okay, so let me move on to the next topic, and this is multinational corporations. I think I've taken too much time on this, but so I'll skip some stuff there. So foreign direct investment is very important.
Can I ask a question on the previous one?
Yes.
So basically, by estimating this directly, you can generate predictions on how cost of trade or tariffs, changing tariffs would affect trade, right?
Right.
Is that doable, or to what extent what are the implications from this estimation for the estimates of sensitivity to tariffs?
Well, so it tells you that there are, that, for example, if you look at adjustments that come only within firms, then the adjustment will be about 2/3.
Of the real adjustment. Of
Yeah.
the overall.
And then the rest has to come from entry or exit of firms, whichever case may be. So you may think, for example, that adjustments through entry and exit are much more involved, and maybe they take even longer. Yes. So you would like to know, how heavy the adjustment relies on entry and exit versus just a firm hiring more workers or fewer workers in order to expand output.
And this is based on the data averaged out for 10 years or?
No, so this estimate, so this is for 1 year. It's from a cross section. Now, if you do it on a 10-year panel, you get something similar. But I don't trust the estimates on panel in here, because over 10 years you have a lot of dynamics which you have to really model if you want to properly estimate. And if you don't model the dynamics, then you make pretty arbitrary assumptions. And these dynamics are correlated; they are not independent. Yeah. But factually, if you just take a panel of 10 years, it looks very much the same. Okay, so about multinationals. So some simple facts. Multinational foreign direct investment has grown very rapidly in the last 25 or 30 years. It has grown faster than trade. And it has grown particularly fast in the 80s and 90s. And of course, with the dot-com bubble collapse in 2000, there was a collapse in foreign direct investment flows, not the stocks. By the way, there wasn't much shift in the stocks, but in the flows. And for a while it was low, and now it's basically at a similar level as it was then. The bulk of FDI is between the advanced countries. So, similarly to trade that I mentioned yesterday, that most of the exports are across the developed countries, FDI is also, for the most part, across the developed countries. There has been traditionally very little FDI across less developed countries, low-income countries. However, very recently, you see a growth in this component, like China investing in India and so on. So there's some movement there, and this movement hasn't been particularly studied. Now, people always think that FDI is driven by tax differentials. So, companies try to find tax havens, and this is where they go to invest. So the answer is yes, this has some effect. But you can explain very little FDI with tax differentials. On the other hand, political risk seems to play a significant role in FDI flows, but this is not a topic I will discuss. There are some characteristics of industries and firms which are involved in FDI and not in others. So, for example, in sectors with high R&D levels, you observe FDI. Sectors with a large number of non-production workers, so you may think that these are sectors which do not only R&D, but management is important, maybe design, things of this sort. In sectors in which there are many new goods, or the goods are complex as measured in different ways, these are also sectors with a lot of FDI. And more generally, sectors with high product differentiation. Sometimes it's measured by advertising, sometimes by the elasticity of substitution, but these are sectors where you observe a lot of FDI. So I'm going to focus on horizontal FDI. So here what you find that the firms involved in FDI are typically very large firms, and they are also very productive. The general pattern that you observe is, and this is true about horizontal and vertical actually, that there is a clear ordering. The least productive firms that survive, they serve the domestic market. A middle range of firms serves exports as well. And only the very top productive firms are engaged in foreign direct investment. Okay, so this is the general pattern. And we'll have something to say about it in a moment. Now for horizontal FDI, the basic theory goes 25 years back to a paper by Jim Marcusen, and Lil Brainard wrote the critical paper which assessed this approach. And this is an approach which emphasizes a trade-off between scale and proximity, essentially. So I wanted to go over the details of this theory, but let me just jump over it. And when we come to the heterogeneity model, you'll see it there. So instead of doing it twice, I'll just do it once. What do I have here? So let me just point out the empirical findings on which this is based. So intuitively, the trade-off between scale and proximity has the following features. So imagine that you want to serve the German market. You are a Russian firm, you want to serve the German market. So you can serve the German market in two ways. You can export your goods which are produced in Russia, or you can build a plant, say, in Germany, and then use the output from your German plant to sell into Germany. So suppose these are the only two options. So what is the trade-off here? Well, you already have a plant in Russia in which you manufacture. So everything, all that's involved are the variable costs. You don't have to bear an additional fixed cost, except maybe the fixed cost of exporting, which we will maintain. But you don't need to build another plant for this. If you go to Germany, you have to build another plant, so there are fixed costs, what we call plant-level fixed costs. So you already are a firm, you have developed the product, but you still have to build the plant. What is the trade-off? If you build the plant in Germany, you save the trading cost, the shipment cost. Sometimes if there are tariffs, you save also the tariffs because you produce behind the tariff wall. So this is what you save. What do you gain by exporting? You save the fixed cost of building the plant in Germany. So this is the proximity concentration trade-off. Now it's important that there are some scale economies which comes through the fixed cost of building the plant of Germany, because otherwise it will not work. So what Lil did, she estimated an equation in which she looked at exports relative to subsidiary sales plus exports using US data. And she found that this is correlated with these two key variables. Namely, you get more exports the higher the cost of building plants or the scale effects in the particular industry firm, and you export less relative to subsidiary sales if the shipment costs are high. And then she argued that there is very little effect from factor endowments, and this sort of raised some debate, but this debate is beyond our need to discuss here, so I'm just going to leave it out. Okay, so how can we go about dealing with this issue? So let's take the model that we discussed yesterday and now allow the firm to choose also whether to export and to engage in foreign direct investment. Okay. So there's a fixed entry cost like we had yesterday. There's a fixed production cost like we had yesterday. And there's a fixed export cost like we had yesterday. But now in addition, so to this, I have added now profits from foreign direct investment. Now they will be always steeper than these. This profit line will be always steeper from here because you save the variable trade cost. So by saving the variable trade cost, you steepen the profit function. And the inequalities that I showed you before ensure that this cutoff is larger than this one, and this cutoff is larger than this one. But you need to assume it if you want to be consistent with the data. So now the selection is very simple. If you look at it, the firms with productivity below this cutoff exit, they cannot survive. And those with productivity between this point and this point here choose to export. So remember, it's not this one anymore. It's between here and, I'm sorry. The firms being the cutoff between this point and this point choose to serve only the domestic market. And firms between this cutoff and this one choose to export. But firms above this cutoff choose to engage in foreign direct investment because profits from FDI are higher here than profits from export. So all the firms above this cutoff here, they serve the foreign market. But the most productive among them do it via FDI, and the less productive in this range here do it via export. Okay? So this idea is easy to embody in a general equilibrium model, in which you can work out all the feedbacks. The important feedbacks are to the demand levels, the sort of B coefficients that were in the previous slide. They are not exogenous, obviously. They depend on endogenous variables. And essentially, it's easy to work this out. And then just look at the cross-country variation, which is what we are interested in this case.
When you talk about this cost of FDI, that is often in the units of labor in the receiving country, right? Which is also endogenous in general equilibrium.
Yeah, it might be, but the way the model has been written is that in the units of the investing country. Now, a lot of these costs are in the units of the investing country, but yes, there are also costs there. So the model is...
that would be a macro,
it could have
macro
been,
endogenous
yeah.
effect.
Okay, so if you solve this model, then you can write, essentially look at the ratio, the type of ratios that Lil-Brainard estimated. Now, you can do it the way she has done it, or directly look at exports relative to subsidiary sales. Her variable is just a monotonic transformation of this ratio. So in this equation, it appears in this form. And basically, it boils down to this, where this V function is exactly the V function that we had before. And has to be evaluated at the two cutoffs. The cutoff at which it becomes profitable to export, and the cutoff at which it becomes profitable to engage in foreign direct investment. And if you want to assume a Pareto distribution, then it basically boils down to something even simpler. Basically, this is the equation if you assume a Pareto distribution. So you have this ratio just a function of all these coefficients. Now, there are three important implications if you use this formulation. First, exports relative to subsidiary sales are declining with trade costs. So this is the standard relationship in the proximity, and the cost of trade trade-off. So it will give a decrease it decreases in transport costs. The other way I think is that it's increasing in the cost of doing FDI. So if there are larger economies of scale for engaging in foreign direct investment, then the larger these economies of scale, then obviously this ratio is going to increase because it becomes costlier to engage in foreign direct investment. So these are just the variables which come from the proximity concentration trade-off. But in this case, there is a new variable that appears, and this is why I wanted you to remember what K is in the Pareto distribution. So the prediction here is that you will observe more foreign direct investment relative to exports if there is more dispersion in productivity across the firms in the industry. Okay? So in sectors with more dispersion, we should observe lower exports relative to subsidiary sales. So the proximity concentration variable should operate exactly in the way they did originally, but we have this additional source of comparative advantage, which comes from dispersion. So the question is this, is this an important source or not? So to do this, you sort of have to estimate this equation, and to estimate it, you need really firm level data, which is a big problem in many cases. And you need firm level data, which includes data on the operation of subsidiaries. So for the US, there is data like this. And the issue then becomes, how do you estimate, what's a good proxy for dispersion? So here it depends very much, which way you want to go and how confident you are in detailed estimates in this sort of data set. So one way you can do it is the following. If you have firm level data, you know exactly the size of every firm. So if you take seriously the theoretical model, you can just estimate the relevant parameter, which is this one, from the data on the size distribution of firms. There is more than one way to do it, but you typically generate similar estimates. So now if you do it separately for every industry, then you get variation across industries in the measures of dispersion. Now alternatively, you can use some non-parametric measure of dispersion, like the standard deviation or some other transform of this. And the point, yeah? Do you have a question?
Yeah, so in some sense, given that what we observe is the conditional distribution of the tail of the firms that enter, one can say is that then why the difference into, so whether it's a difference in distribution rather than difference in fixed costs across these different industries.
Oh, you have to control for fixed costs. You have to control for fixed costs. But the fixed costs are going to determine the cutoffs, right? Now, if you suppose that you believe, it depends sort of what you believe. So this is why I said it sort of depends on what you have confidence or not. Suppose your point of departure is that the underlying distribution is an untruncated Pareto. Okay? If this is the case, you can estimate the shape parameter just from the upper tail. You don't need the lower tail. So this is basically what you need to believe in order to use this. If not, you have to use something else. You have to decide exactly what to do. So if you use non-parametric representations of dispersion, you have to have confidence that they approximate correctly the underlying distribution. Because you never have the underlying distribution, you don't observe the exiters unless you were to use some dynamic model of entry and exit over time and be able to have detailed information about every firm, when it enters, when it exits, and so on. So you have to have some faith in these things. So what I'm going to argue is that it doesn't matter how you do it, the estimates look very much the same. So you can feel convinced that this is the case or not, but that's basically what you can do with the data. So the basic idea is that variation across sectors in the degree of dispersion. And now the question is, how do we compare dispersion in the electronics industry with dispersion in the pulp and wood? And you have to make a stand on this.
But to be clear here, so do we take on faith that such a dispersion exists? So it's genuinely different. So it's not there's something else that we observe. Meaning, so if we take the different industries and we look at the whatever possible productivity draws that firms might have, there's no underlying laws that the same across the industries where this productivity will come from. The industries are genuinely different one from another.
Yeah, you have to take it on faith.
So that we cannot verify in data.
Yeah. You have to take it because otherwise you cannot estimate. You cannot estimate something that you don't observe. You can estimate only on things that you observe. So you have to take a stand on this. You have really no choice. You have to take a stand. Now once you take a stand, you can do all sorts of things. You can do a Kolmogorov or Smirnov test or whatever you want, but you have to take a stand on this. This is like if you want to study countries, for example, yes, if you want to study many countries, you cannot use firm level data because there's no way to pull firm level data for a large number of countries. So you have to have some faith that when you disregard the firm level effects, that you can, from sectoral effects or otherwise, extract information of interest. Otherwise, you cannot do it. And this is the same here. Okay, so in this particular study, there's a variety of measures of dispersion that have been used. Some of them, again, you see the measure of dispersion, you can say the underlying one may differ across countries. So if you want to be very accurate, you cannot do it for many country cases. But in any case, in this case, we look at the US data and the US companies. And we use the estimates that we used of dispersion come from the US data and also from the Amadeus data set, which includes European companies, a large number. And as I said, the outcomes don't look very different. So for the US data, the important thing to note is the following. First, in the data, the productivity differences across the different groups of firms go in the right direction, they are substantial. So this estimate says that if you compare non-multinational exporters to firms which sell only domestically, then the non-multinational exporters have a close to 40% productivity advantage over those who sell only the domestic market. Okay? So this is the differential in the average productivity. Then if you look at the multinationals, they have a productivity advantage of about 55% over the local firms, those who serve only the domestic market. And the difference between the multinationals and the exporters is about 15%. So this is just a rough comparison across these different groups of firms. Okay, then if you estimate Lille-Brainard's equation, then using essentially her variables, freight, tariffs, and these are the fixed costs, which this measure is problematic, but this is basically what everybody uses, the non-production workers. And then there's a bunch of alternative dispersion measures here. So this is the standard deviation in the US, the standard deviation in Europe, only in France, because I don't know if you know, but the Amadeus data set is very much biased towards French firms. And then some other measures. And you compare now the coefficients. These are the averages across a number of estimates. These are beta coefficients, so you can compare them across the variables. So this is the impact on freight and tariffs. They are of the same order of magnitude. The fixed costs have a bigger impact. And here's the bunch of dispersion measures, different dispersion measures. And the key point here is that the impact of dispersion on exports relative to subsidiary sales is of the same order of magnitude as the others. And this is the only point to take from it. Okay? So the point is now the following, that generally speaking, if this is the theory that you have in mind, then there are important implications of dispersion. And if you believe these estimates, then these implications are also quantitatively important. Okay, that's basically the only point I want to make. And this is all I have to say for today. And this sort of wraps up the 2 lectures on heterogeneity. And by popular or not popular demand, tomorrow I talk about political economy.
Any questions or comments on?
So yeah, I have a question on the slide, the last one slide on the multinational versus non-multinational exporters. Are there multinationals that also export in the very same country? I guess that makes no sense, but since the disaggregation of products is not perfect, maybe I don't know. You export trucks, but you locally produce cars.
Yeah, no, they do. Multinationals. So the issue is the following: multinationals, U.S. multinationals. I cannot say about what happens in other countries. I know less about other countries. U.S. multinationals, even if they have subsidiary which sells domestically, they often export to intermediate inputs. So it's not that. So there are almost always some exports involved. But these estimates are based on aggregating firm-level data to the industry level, because you look at the variation dispersion across industries, and also these other characteristics are industry-specific, not firm-specific. So you use the firm-level data to build the right variables, so to speak. But yes, multinationals export.
But conceptually, in terms of your theory, are these different products?
Yes.
Different units? Are different divisions of the multinational?
Right.
Different products?
Well, I didn't, as I said, I'm focusing on horizontal FDI. So I've put aside all the vertical part. And also the model has been built in a very simple way so that there are no intermediate inputs. Right? So if you want to deal with it, you have to decompose the inputs of the multinational in the destination country into those that they acquire domestically and those that they acquire from the parent firm. Now this is not going to change this prediction in any dramatic way, I don't think so. Yeah.
Actually, I have 2 questions, technical and philosophical. So the technical one here is that related to dispersion, that if we measure it depending on firm size and distribution.
Can you speak up?
Sorry, okay, so if we measure dispersion based on firm size and distribution of the sizes, then it seems that how concentrated the industry is, and many of the firms there might be very much related. And I'm not sure whether that will affect the results one way or another. So this is kind of, I don't know, it's just something that concentration seems to might be important here. And the philosophical.
No, but concentration is endogenous in this world.
Yes, but
right?
It's if it brings to empirical observation, so that this we know that it's not pure monopolistic competition and all, things like that. So I'm not sure.
Right.
So I'm not sure whether there is room to bring up, how concentrated industries are in the picture.
Well, most of the industries are not. I mean, I don't know what you can use measures of concentration, but this is not going to tell you very much. Most of these data use disaggregation on 52 industries, I think. Okay, so this is essentially what the Bureau of Economic Analysis gives you. So this is, you have really no choice. Within this level of disaggregation, there are many, many firms in every industry. Many, many firms. I don't remember the number, but it's a very big number of firms in every industry. So it's not a case where you'll have 3 or 4 competitors. It doesn't happen. There are lots of firms in each industry at this level of disaggregation.
And so a philosophical question is that now think about trade policy. It seems to be within this paradigm, let's say, there is, besides the usual tariffs, quotas, there is a room for affecting this cost, affecting direct foreign direct investment, for instance, through affecting the cost of doing business or cost of building a factory.
Right.
And I wonder then what would be, can you know, think what would be for the optimal policies for the countries in terms of, you know, playing with those variables.
Yeah, so there isn't much work on this. The only piece of analysis that I know of is by a student, ex-student of mine. His name is Devin Shaw. And he graduated, I think, 2 years ago. So he has in his dissertation a chapter where he analyzes some of these policies. As you can imagine, they are quite complex.
Yeah.
And occasionally, there might be room in an optimal design for direct intervention in the cost of establishing business, the way it is. The answer is yes. So, and this, of course, this policy interacts with the trade policy. So it depends. What is the optimal policy in this setup depends very much on what are the constraints on policy formation. Why is this important? It's important for the following reason. Most of the countries, they are members of the WTO, and they cannot arbitrarily impose tariffs, for example. So, given the limitations on the tariff policy, especially since you are not allowed to discriminate across countries, it's often the case that you gain by intervention in entry. By the way, not just for foreign direct investment, but just generally speaking, entry into the industry. So the answer is yes. There are many cases in which this would be a reasonable policy. If there is an issue, another issue here again, if you will not invite retaliation, which happens quite often these days.
One have to study general equilibrium model of putting one level more into, you know, kind of
this model is general equilibrium model.
No, yeah,
this is not the issue.
Putting the up to, you know, some kind of, you know, general equilibrium / game theoretic model where firms simultaneously choose these levels themselves.
Right. So this has not been done. So you know, equilibrium policy structures where countries choose their policies in this type of environment has not been started. Actually. In competitive environments, there has been substantial work on, for example, on equilibrium tariff policies, where there's a game between the governments. But in this environment, it hasn't been done. Yeah.
Larry,
As I understood, you work a lot with empirical data, and I wonder, can you find something non-trivial in, for example, you compare simple export and FDI, right? And somebody use purely economic arguments to choose or to export or to build a plant in a neighboring country, right? Purely economic arguments. But when you look at the empirical data, probably there are hidden parameters, like if one country wants to take over another country, it can invest and to buy a piece of land and so on. And it is possible to reveal the statistical data.
I don't think at this scale that people are working. I, by the way, don't do a lot of empirical work, but I talk a lot about it. I don't do a lot about it. But I'm sure, yeah, there are elements like this, but I mean, I don't think one can pick it up when one studies 90 or 100 countries or 150 countries. But people worry about this in some cases, or foreign direct investment. The issue of expropriation risk is an important issue, right? And this is also, you pick it up in the data. So if you use some measures of expropriation risk, then you estimate an FDI equation, this will have an impact on how much is invested in the market. So this much we know. And in specific cases, you can work out more detail, but I don't think one can do it for large samples of countries. Yes.
I suppose that we're getting to the transition to political economy anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess then what we should do is meet here tomorrow, same time, same place, and thank you very much for telling us about trade. We look forward to political economy. Thank you.
Okay.
A sister of international trade theory, which is the theory of international migration. As far as I know, well, all models that I know are based on differences in productivities. So workers are less productive. Workers of a certain skill are less productive in country A, and they are more productive in country B, and they move from A to B. And we would expect that this migration is one way. So people from Uzbekistan go clean streets in Moscow, and people from Russia do not go clean streets in Tashkent. But I also think there may be a possibility for intra-industry migration. So, for example, Princeton University hires Oleg Iskhoki from Russia, and New Economic School hires Paul Dowd from the United States. Well, I don't have the data, but I would expect that this kind of migration may be substantial and rising. So do you know any discussion of this kind of phenomenon and any literature on this?
Two-way migration within industry.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So you
By the way, if once you move to this type of world, there is no neat separation of the type that you started with, namely that actual lean, say, explains intersectoral and monopolistic competition explains intra-industry. Because from what I just said, they become intertwined. Yes, so it's hard to sort of make this clean separation. But I mean, the issue you raise is the following, that it's possible in this type of environment that the productivity, even you start with the same technologies, then the productivity differences can be such that they will move factor prices in different directions. You can easily get that there will be higher real rewards to both sectors, in the same country. So everybody will want to go to the same country. Now, whether it's possible to have a movement in factor prices so that one becomes higher in one country and not in the other, I actually don't know the answer. But again, you can work it out and tell us tomorrow.
So the difficulty of calculation is going up with every question. Other questions? Yes.
Every period there are assumes that there are new entrants and assumes that leads the industry, right? What if few periods in a row there are entrants will be more effective than firms that leads the industry. Then cut-off level of phi will shift, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know what you have exactly in mind, but there are these are comparative statics. Okay, so you can think about it in two different ways. If it's a static model, then what you do is you compare a world with low, say, trade cost with a world with high trade cost. So in each such world, there are firms which enter the industry, and those who find that they cannot survive, they just leave. The other interpretation is the dynamic interpretation that I described before, and then these results apply only to the steady state. So they don't apply to the transitional dynamics. So you cannot sort of think about firms that are entrenched in the industry versus new entrants. You have to think about how the two economies look in their respective steady state, if it's a dynamic variable. Now, the issue of transitional dynamics is actually very important. And nobody has so far worked out the analytics of it.
So you have until tomorrow.
Huh?
That could go to Thursday.
Yeah, we can go on until Thursday. So there's some work. I mean, people didn't work out the analytics of it in the simpler model. So usually, when you see work on the transitional dynamics, then either there are some very strong assumptions used, or alternatively, people use numerical methods. But the fact of the matter is that if you wanted to deal with trade policy, you will be interested in particular in the transitional dynamics. But I can't, I can't give you an answer to how if you look at that.
You can also look at learning by the dynamic economies of scale, learning by doing effects, but they never solve it.
Yeah.
It's very hard to solve.
I'm curious about the last point you've been saying, that there is a straight correlation that denies the Ricardian comparative advantage, Ricardian trade interception. So the question which I have is, like, theoretically it's a nice feature, of course, but the question is, if we start from the fact that the Ricardian theory wasn't satisfactory in terms of the imperial implications, because basically the countries which are seem to be looking closer to each other, similar to each other, trade more rather than less. So what's the idea? And why would you want to individualize?
Whether you want or not, this is, it's there. I mean, they didn't do anything particular. They just built a two-sector model. Yes. So now you could, for example, there's no evidence on these issues. One thing that you could try to examine is whether productivity differences across countries, relative productivity differences, are correlated with differences in factor endowment. Right? Now, if you found this, then this will support this finding. If not, no. But I don't think that they tried to endogenize it. It came up. That's it. So
We have to look at the data until tomorrow. Other questions?
By the way, you can get Ricardian type comparative advantage also in dynamic economies, like with learning or otherwise. They arise there too sometimes.
Yes.
Whenever you have trade liberalization, you have a transfer of wealth from less efficient firms to more efficient firms and to the labor force. Did anyone try to look at the political economy of the degree to which trade is liberalized in this setting?
You mean in this type of environment?
Yes.
No, not really. But I don't know if I would call it a transfer of wealth. I mean, in principle, it's possible that everybody... So, for example, in this environment, there are gains from trade.
Yes, creation.
Okay? So the question is whether one party gains at the expense of another, or they all gain. Now, we usually don't think about firms as entities whose welfare we measure. We think that firms are owned by individuals, and then the question is what happens to the well-being of this individual.
Yes,
But this, by the way, if you want to really answer it, again, then these type of simple comparative statics are not the right setup to look at. If you think about the dynamic framework, you cannot disregard the transitional dynamics. If you have a framework like this, the question is who owns these firms? If the ownership is skewed, the distribution of ownership is very skewed, then yes, what's going to happen is the owners of the high productivity firms will do better than the other. But if these owners also work, then their real wage goes up, and even if they lose through their ownership in the low productivity firms, they may still gain on net, but maybe they don't. I don't know what the answer is.
No questions? So thank you very much again. There is a